Hi there, this is Steve Kaufman here again with the third in my summer sessions. Remember that I ask my viewers to send me questions via Twitter with the hashtags AskSteve, and I try to answer a couple of those questions every week. This week, first of all, I'm just back from Romania. I had a fabulous trip there. It was very brief. I was able to speak Romanian. I was very well received because I spoke Romanian. And I will be doing an interview in Romanian with subtitles next week with one of my Romanian tutors, and we will talk about my visit to Romania. But today I'm going to combine three questions that I received in sort of one answer. And the questions that I received were, one, how do I go about choosing these pattern sentences that I used for learning Romanian? Second question was, how do I learn grammar? And the third question was, what do I use besides link? So I want to combine these to some extent. With regard to grammar, to me grammar is largely a matter of patterns, so that I find it easier to see lots of examples of the different grammatical patterns rather than trying to piece together an understanding based on an explanation of the rules. And the more explanations I read, the more kind of confused I get. That's not entirely true, but to a large extent. Whereas if I can see examples, patterns, things become clearer to me. So I brought some, it's a little bit of a reach here, but for example, in learning Romanian, I was able to find this grammar book, which I can't even remember what it was called, but it was just full of examples. So that for every, you can't really see it very well, but for every pattern of the language, there were lots and lots of examples. And so I read this over and over again. I go back to it as a resource. Another question that was asked was, how much time do I spend on the details of the language versus just listening and reading? This was with specific reference to learning the Chinese characters. But I think it applies to everything. You have the bits and pieces, the grammar rules, the reviewing of word lists, learning of characters, versus the sort of general input, reading and listening. And I think as a general rule, it's about 70 to 80% input, 20 to 30% bits and pieces, details, and eventually more and more output. But getting back to this idea of grammar, to me, grammar requires you to have a lot of exposure to patterns. You can find these patterns in your listening and reading as you develop your ability to notice, but it's often useful to see a sort of dedicated list of these patterns. There was a Russian book that I found, 53 models of Russian usage. As I say, this one Romanian grammar book had lots of examples. And so here you'll notice that as I'm answering the question about grammar and where to find patterns, I'm also dealing with this issue of what do I use besides link. I tend to buy starter books, like everybody else. I shouldn't have left these things so far away. Just a second here, excuse me. Ah, boy. There. Bit of a slow start with all the jet lag and everything coming back from Romania. But hey, you're getting this live. So, I'll buy this, Teach Yourself or Colloquial. And I'll work my way through them, but I continue to refer to them because they sort of touch on the grammar. But the big advantage with these books is that they have questions and drills in every chapter, which I don't do. But if you look at the answers in the back of the book, you tend to get a concentrated list of sample patterns because they'll tend to want to drill you on one thing at a time. So I like to touch briefly. Okay, in chapter 8 they talked about whatever it was, the subjunctive or something. And then the grammar explanation I kind of get a little foggy on. But if I go to the back of the book, I'll see 10 answers to the questions. And so then that's drilling that pattern into me. So if I vary a certain amount of looking at the rule and the explanation, even more looking at the patterns, concentrated dosage of different patterns, if I vary that with general listening and reading, sort of a 30 to 70 ratio, then slowly I start to get used to grammar. So that's how I deal with the grammar. And, there are other books, for example. In Korean, this was an excellent book. called Continuing Korean by Ross King out of University of British Columbia, and there are lots of sample sentences. So you just gotta, get that concentrated dosage of these patterns, the different grammatical patterns, and then try to look for them when you're listening and reading. Some of the grammatical explanations and the terms used in explaining grammar, particularly in Korean, I just find I can't relate to. But I believe the brain will pick up on patterns if we get enough exposure to the patterns, both in concentrated dosage through these lists and by looking at some of the explanations. All of those things, looking at patterns of the language in use, I find I get better retention than if I look at something like this, for example. I have bought these books in the past, but I find them very difficult. I listen, I keep it by the toilet or something, I kind of review it, but it doesn't sink in. And yet, I admit, I still go back and I look at the tables of the verbs, but if I can see them in usage, patterns of them in usage, then that's much better. So now, getting back to this idea of patterns, patterns in the language, I was asked, how do you come up with the patterns? For example, the patterns that I used for Romanian. Remember that I wrote out about 150, 200 sentences divided into 20 or so different patterns, which I had someone in Romania translate and record for me. And so, I think there we just have to use our imagination. How do we select those patterns? Think of something that you would like to be able to say in the language. Think of the patterns like if and because and since and when and therefore and however and why. And these are all the kinds of keywords that trigger certain patterns in every language. Tenses is another. In every language we have to explain purpose, cause and effect, the future, the past, other relationships, so that, if we even come up with them in English and then have them, translated and recorded, I think that's tremendously useful. It's something that we're trying to do more of at LINC with our new exchange setup there, to get people to put up typical patterns of things that they would like to say and to have them translated and recorded. I know that Moses McCormick has a list of what he considers to be sort of the key patterns or the key questions and answers in learning a language. So I think coming up with patterns is not that difficult to do. Not all patterns, like you'll have patterns in Japanese that don't necessarily match the patterns in, say, English. So that to some extent you have to find patterns that are specific to a language, because all languages have their own very specific, unique ways of saying certain things. And what might be one pattern in language A might be 2 or 3 patterns in language B. We don't have, for example, the same concept of active and or at least perfective and imperfective aspects of verbs that the Russians have. So you have to focus on some of those patterns and so on. So to summarize here, because I've rambled a bit, the question was, how should you study grammar? How do I select patterns for these pattern sentences that I use? And what material do I use outside LINC? So to summarize, I believe that to learn grammar, you need to spend perhaps 15-20% of your time dealing with these sort of nuts and bolts of the language, specifically grammar. But that time should be split between looking at the explanation, but maybe, and not maybe, but certainly more than that, getting concentrated doses of these patterns. How do you find the patterns? Well, if you have a book like Teach Yourself or one of those, and most books where they have drills and questions, if you go to the answer section, you'll find a concentrated dosage of patterns. So that's one way of getting patterns. The other way is to just come up with 20 or 30 types of things that you feel that you would like to say in the language, and ask someone to translate and record it for you. Something that you can do. There's a number of websites where you can do that, including, of course, LINC. And in terms of material outside LINC that I use, I tend to get myself a starter book when I'm getting started. I find that useful. And as soon as I can, I start to read in the language. So very early, I was reading about Central European history in Czech. I'm on the internet scouring for, radio programs with transcripts so that I want to avail myself of authentic content, which is in a sense outside LingQ, but I bring it into LingQ in order to be able to read it. So I do use a lot of material outside LingQ. A, to get me started, and B, as meaningful content that I can import into LingQ. So a bit of a ramble, and I hope that I touched on those three subjects in response to questions that I received. Next week, I'm going to talk about fluency, what fluency means, and how one can achieve fluency. How quickly can one achieve fluency, and also comparing working towards fluency in the country where the language is spoken and away from where the language is spoken. So we'll see you next week, and thank you for listening.